So welcome back for our third session this Friday. There is a diagram that we have developed to describe some of the things that we're looking at in a Christian approach to critical thinking for effective learning in classrooms. Firstly, there is the focus on knowledge, science, maths, and history. And so there will be a bit of a focus in critical thinking on how do we observe, how do we measure, how do we write down and describe the way things are going. And if we were to apply that to a classroom situation, then we want lots of careful observation. This is how the students are going, careful record keeping. This is what's unfolding, and careful evaluation that includes others and asks others, what do we know? We also want some consideration of history. So we'll think about the history of the students, the background, the history of the school, what's the culture of the school, and most importantly, our own personal history as teachers. And so we'll take some time in assignment 2 to write down about our personal history and how we have grown and developed and our views, but recognizing that as Christians, this can continue to change and we can become more the people that God has called us to be. And even though we face some challenges in life, and at times we've been shy and at other times too loud, there are ways in which God calls us to be the people that He's called us to be. This relies on the 5 senses and sensory perception. However, in critical thinking, there is more than knowledge and the senses like sight. There is also intuition. And as human beings, we have a capacity to sense certain things are right and wrong. And this leads to ethics. And this is more challenging to work through. And as Christians, we have both in the Old Testament and Deuteronomy, the notion that ethics, what is true and good and right, has been revealed to us in various ways, including through scripture and including through our conscience and including through the community of people around us and including our society that has laws. And so ethics is going to be important, and it's an important goal in education to develop the ethical nature and the character of the students. And so we're going to give a class about week 8 or 9 to ethics and critical thinking and how ethics and character are important in critical thinking. In terms of intuition and the unseen, what is inside, we also have the aesthetics, art and dance and music and all of the arts and humanities and storytelling. All of that can touch the nature of the human being. And in any story, there is going to be some sort of emphasis on what is good and true, I think, in the story. And then there'll be something in the story about what can go wrong, which can touch evil and bad. And so if you want to write a good story, begin by saying this is the good things, and then have a crisis come along and then work through the resolution of the crisis. And I think the best stories have the crisis resolved at the end. But there are other ways to write stories as well. So there is knowledge through the senses, science and maths and history, and there is knowledge that's more intuitive that relates to the human person, humanities, aesthetics, creative arts, and ethics. And this leads us then on to imagination and creativity and value and worth, and also on to spiritual ways of knowing. That is, in eternity past, God has made the world we live in, and there is a sense in which we go on living in heaven and eternity in the future. And there's a sense in which we're embodied in this world, and our embodied nature has emotion, our embodied nature has feelings and inner senses and can feel hurt and disappointed, and all of that's going on in the classroom as well. So the ways of knowing not only include the sciences, which is the more common description of critical thinking, it also includes the intuitions and ethics, and it includes imagination, and it includes emotion and feelings. And so this diagram helps you understand something of the complexities of critical thinking that goes beyond scientific thinking to include all of the humanities, and also it includes the whole person and emotions. And we'll have a whole week where we'll look at emotions and what this involves. And a school is often going to be teaching students in maths and science and in English and humanities and the arts, as well as in the physical embodied education, as well as imagination, and also technology and other subjects as well. So these are all different fields of knowledge that we will look at through the weeks, and we'll think about how critical thinking should involve every aspect of schooling. And then we'll also look at the methods that each of these can contribute. So science and maths can contribute, but also history contributes, but the arts and drama and dance can contribute, ethics can contribute, emotions can contribute. All of these are involved in what it means to have a fully thought out understanding of what is going on. So critical thinking often just focuses on the more scientific, observe and describe, as Aristotle does, but Socrates and Plato would say there's much more going on, and it's useful if we understand much more that is going on. Just getting a few more ideas on what stood out to you, Nat, so far in this class and in the first two classes today.
I like how we've just been through that it's not just what we learn in regards to history and maths. There's a lot more involved in our thinking and our learning, and different ways in what we can learn in regards to the intuition, and also how much emotion and the feelings are attached to how and what we learn.
And that's so important, isn't it, when we consider our students, that we will have some students who are very logical and scientific, but we'll have others who are more relational and intuitive, and we need to honour all of the different personalities that are there. And that's so hard when you've got many different students from many different backgrounds, but it's so important as well. And so, yeah, I think that will be very, very important. Karen, what stood out to you so far from this lesson and the previous two lessons today?
Today, that was very interesting, that little graph or diagram that you showed us. I really enjoyed that, to look at that and look at how everything comes into together to work well within the classroom. I love how, to me, it looks very inclusive, and that's what it's about. It's not just sort of looking at just all the top scholars. You're looking at everyone across the board within the classroom, whether, you know, they're fast learners, slow learners, from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. It's about inclusivity and how we can sort of tap into all their little different areas of how they learn.
Yeah, so good. And I think that's what a Christian approach really brings, is the acknowledgement that if every person is a miraculous creation of God, then every person is there in the classroom having something to contribute, having something to learn and receive. There's value in every student, and we need to recognise the value of every student. So today we're very much focused on the scientific approach. And so we've gone through looking at Aristotle and his emphasis in the scientific approach, and we'll see more of that later. One of the things that we can think about with the scientific approach is that Aristotle and those who put a focus on scientific approach would sometimes say, don't read the books, observe, describe as things are. And so they would say, if you read the books, that only makes you biased, because you then follow the book writers. And what if the book writers got it wrong? So if you were to read the Greeks, then you'll become a Greek thinker. So don't read the Greeks. And if you were to read Martin Luther, you'll become a Lutheran. Not that that's a bad thing, but don't read so much Luther, just observe. And so describe students the way they are. This is called inductive thinking. So inductive thinking observes and describes things as they are, and it works from the ground up. And there is an approach to thinking called grounded theory. So in grounded theory, you don't read the books, you simply observe things as they are. And so grounded theory seeks to observe what it can, and it's evidence-based. That is, it looks at the way things can be understood. And so grounded theory included in many research studies. It describes what it can see and observe. So you don't ask what other people say about this student. You don't ask what the records say about the student. You look at the student and how they're going, and you work with what they are doing. So grounded theory is about observing, describing what you can see, working from the ground up. Now, Glasser and Strauss are said to be founders of grounded theory, and they said that this is very, very useful. And you can see that in healthcare, rather than coming in with a preconceived idea as to what can be wrong, then grounded theory can be helpful. Any thoughts on what are the strengths and limitations of grounded theory? Can I get everyone to write down what are the strengths and limitations of grounded theory? So there's both strengths and limitations of grounded theory. And I teach research students sometimes who are so keen to use grounded theory, and they say, in my study of how to teach mathematics or how to teach science, I'm going to do a grounded theory approach. I'm going to observe these 20 students, and I'm going to observe them using this method, and I'm going to see how it goes. I'm not going to be swayed by the biases of books that I could read. I'm going to have a pure, fresh mind, and I'm just going to read what I'm going to see. Tiffany, what do you see as the strengths and limitations of this grounded theory approach?
So what I have written down, the strength is that there's no influence. There's no one else's opinions that you're taking into your study. And the limitations, I would say, is having no knowledge of the background, no knowledge of how the person thinks their left brain or their right brain, no knowledge of how they were brought up. You know, if this is their first year in a real school, maybe they were homeschooled, you know, all of these different things you have no idea about.
Exactly. So that's very well said there. Karen, what were your thoughts on the strengths and limitations of grounded theory?
So my strengths were your own observations will or can determine method of teaching. And like Tiff said, there's no external influences. And the weaknesses is that if you're in a classroom of, say, 25 students, you're observing all the students, and that would be difficult to actually dissect everything that's going on with each particular student. And like Tiff said, you've got no knowledge of the student's history.
Yeah. So my recommendation would be that any research writing that you do, often it's a good idea to begin with writing down your observations before you actually do research. And you might even have to do this weeks before you start, because you've got to make time. So begin by writing down your observation and thoughts, but recognizing these could be wrong, because there's lots of other things could be going on. And then my thought is that you have to do a literature review. That is, you have to get the best knowledge, but you have to also have a humility where you are willing to give this up, because your knowledge could be wrong. What the other teacher says about the students could be wrong. So you need a humility to be willing to give up what you are gathering information on. And you need to recognize biases. And so I think it's worth writing down. If you're a Christian, you write down, I'm a Christian. I see things from this Christian perspective. I'm a European. I see things from this European perspective. So acknowledge your biases. And then I think you can do both. I think you can do grounded theory, which is called induction, and inductive thinking. Whereas if you start from the knowledge and the books and the writing, that is called deduction. So deduction is working down from D for deduction, D for down, working down from knowledge already gained. And so in scientific understanding, people will generally draw on the knowledge that's already been developed, and they'll do a literature review, and then they will humbly admit there could be other ways of looking at the evidence, and then they'll look at the evidence. Or in a classroom, you would observe the student, but you would then go and talk to the other teachers, but you'd humbly acknowledge there could be biases there, and say you will be open to other ways of viewing things. And then I would say network with others and be open to others as well. So in one of the weeks, we're going to look towards the end, about week 10 or 11, we'll look at group think. So there's always a danger when you've got other people around you that the other people influence the way you think. So every school will have a culture, and you'll all think in a certain way because of the school you're a part of. So there's a group think going on. And one of the real dangers of groupthink is that if the other person says yes, then you'll think, it's all agreed then, and you'll often surrender to the other person. So groupthink has certain dangers whereby, we don't need to teach school till 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon. We could knock off every day at lunchtime. And I could mention this to Bridget, what do you think of this idea? And Bridget may not think a great deal about it. Oh, she's shaking her head. But if she didn't think so much about it, and Sam said it must be a good idea, so it just said yes. And I would think, Bridget said it, so it must be a good idea. Group think is coming into play there, whereby we think the other person said it, I've said it, etc. Hannah, what are your thoughts about group think? What are the actually, let's get everyone to write down, what are the strengths and limitations of group think? So strengths and limitations of group think. So when you think about something, there's strengths in that, and then there's limitations. The classic example of the limitation is the Challenger space shuttle disaster. So they had put O-rings on the space shuttle that wouldn't operate below 15 Fahrenheit or 0 centigrade or whatever. And then on the morning of the launch of the space shuttle, the president of the US was going to give a speech, and he wanted to say how wonderful the space shuttle program was. And there were people who thought, hang on, we know that the O-rings aren't going to work. Do we speak up? And there'd be 20 or 30 people maybe who knew about it. But every one of them thought, if it's not going to work, the others would have spoken up. So none of them spoke up. and yet there was lots of people knew it wasn't going to work, and the Challenger space shuttle would blow up. So that was an example of the limitations of group think there. Yeah, so Olivia, what do you identify as some of the strengths and limitations of groupthink?
I'm not 100% sure, but I think the limitations would be like the challenges, like it's this way or the highway.
So
like,
good.
And a limitation would be like not having, like, you're not going to get other people's views on, you know, what the challenges could be for the children and things like that. It's just like, this is what's wrong, and they're not open to try new things.
Yeah, so good. So it's important to have an openness to try new things. Karen, what are your thoughts on the strengths and limitations of groupthink?
Okay, a positive thing about group thinking I would put down as that as a collective, you're all on the same page, so you're all doing the same thing. So you're following the same structure within the classroom. You're all doing, so if a child goes from one classroom to another, for example, in my role as additional needs support, I've implemented in every classroom from kindergarten to year 2 that each child has a to Z desk mat on their desk. So if a child goes to another classroom because maybe their teacher's away, they've got that consistency within the room, and they know where they can find the answers to things. The negatives, I think, is that like my way or the highway, we're like just sheep, we're just following everybody else. We're not entitled to our opinion, or our thoughts are not heard.
Yeah, so good. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, that this is another benefit in critical thinking. Consider the views of others, similar to the deductive approach, that is, read what others have said, find the best material in your literature review, read through it, find the best theories and the best ideas. But at the same time, there's the limitation that you point out, is that if we're each just following each other around in circles, then groupthink can be a very dangerous process. So scientific thinking seeks to observe and describe what it can see with the eyes, with the senses, and Aristotle is seen to be one of the founders of scientific thinking. And in inductive thinking, Aristotle's method of simply observing and describing can be very, very important. But there is so much more going on, and that we need to be aware of the much more that's going on. In week 5, we're going to have a look at mathematics. And one of the things that we're going to observe is that maths is very important in science and in critical thinking. So it enables us to describe with some certainty and clarity what is going on. So if we say that the students who work their way through a particular book are going to have knowledge, and we know that 60 or 70% are going to do well, then that's good when buying a car. Numbers and mathematics can tell us about fuel consumption, kilometres per litre, depreciation, interest payments. So maths is in every year level of schooling, and it's said to increase our ability to investigate claims of truth all around us. And it's said to be free of emotion, and it's said to be scientific. And so we could talk about Spanish flu epidemic, deaths, fatality. However, again, this is an overuse of science in that it doesn't explain everything that is going on. Certainly as a nurse or a doctor, it's important to use evidence-based, and you can do analysis of the risks of death. And I've done that myself. I rang up, I had a life insurance policy, and I thought, do I cancel my life insurance policy or not? So I Googled, what are the chances? And I put in my age and what are the chances of dying? And then I looked at my average life expectancy. And then I looked at the chances of dying over the number of years ahead. And I worked it all out. And then I rang up the life insurance people and I said, I've just worked out that I'm paying such and such an amount for life insurance and I've got such and such a chance of dying and all of this. And they said, we don't normally have people who ring up with that sort of having worked that out. So maths can be useful. It can help you to make decisions such as life insurance policies and all sorts of decisions you can use maths for. And that's why in a classroom, in teaching, it can be useful to say students have got, I know teachers who will say, this student got 37.3% and this other student got 37.7%. I mean, can we distinguish that difference in grading between those two students? I mean, you got to ask, sometimes mathematics can claim things which aren't totally true. I have another theory. I'm in here in Brisbane teaching at the moment. However, most people in Australia live in Victoria and New South Wales. So I'm probably not here in Brisbane. I'm more probably in New South Wales. Is that true? So statistics really can mess with your brain, can't it? It can sort of say things which may not be totally true. Statistics, however, does work out that approximately 100% of people pass away at the end of their life. So approximately. So statistics can tell us some interesting information. And there has been a move over the last 50 to 100 years towards increasingly using statistics and charts to communicate scientific information. And so I encourage you to think about the strengths and limitations of maths. In week 5, we'll look further at the importance of mathematics, how you use mathematics in so many of your subjects and the many benefits of that. We'll look at probability theory. One of the very interesting things about maths, though, is that because of the beauty and the consistency of mathematics, philosophers like Plato and Pythagoras and others have said that it points to the God who makes the world, that the beauty and simplicity of maths points to a God, a designer, just like architecture points to a God and a designer behind all things. And it's interesting to reflect on the beauty that's in the universe all around us and how that can be a real pointer to there is something more going on. Scientific approaches to study can break down the nature of the human being and see that the human being is carbon atoms and water. But many people have seen a sense of order in the universe that believes that there is a sense of design and someone behind it all. And this is what Plato would have said that goes beyond what Aristotle said. Pythagoras, born 570, called the universe a cosmos, from which we get the word cosmetic, referring to the order in the world, giving a sense of beauty in the world. In Timaeus, Plato describes the way in which order and beauty in the universe appear to have a rational, purposeful, beneficial originator in the handiwork from a divine craftsman called the demiurge. So if you want to read that, just type in free online Plato's Timaeus, and you have a discussion that he sets up there using Socratic dialogue about the purposefulness of the world and the sense of order that's in the world. And when we see a human being, some people, I know someone recently said, I don't believe in God. I believe that we are all carbon-based creatures. And so That's all I believe in, is that there are carbon atoms and carbon creatures that account for everything. And I took a Lego block and I said, I don't believe that there is a manufacturing plant for Lego. I think Lego just happened. And just in the same way, carbon atoms just happened, and love and beauty and ethics and goodness just happen. But when I see the human being, I see a sense of beauty and order and complexity that points to something. When I see a cell, observation goes beyond scientifically describing all the different parts of the cell and the nucleus and the chromosomes, and it sees that there is much more going on. When we look up the stars and all that's going on there, it speaks to much more that's going on. When we see the earth and we see the moon, these speak of much more. There's a uniqueness about the earth, which just at the right position in order for life to exist on earth. There's a uniqueness about every one of the elements, like Lego blocks in the periodic table of the elements in chemistry, that points to a sense of order that's going on. And in the universe, just as Plato wrote about in Timaeus, and just as Genesis and the Bible talks about, there is much, much more going on. So some people, like Richard Dawkins, say that the universe is meaningless and just happens by chance, but it's the way of looking at the world. There's a young girl there and there's an old person there. What preconceptions and language do we bring to the way we view it? So can everyone see the young girl? Hands up those who can't see the young girl, with the nose there, etc., and the ear and the eyes. And can everyone see the old lady? There's a mouth there and a nose, and the ear becomes the eye. So there are preconceptions that we bring to our views of our students in our classroom. There are preconceptions that we bring to the beauty in the universe. Did it happen by chance, or is there a designer? Light behaves, and the different ways we see things. So scientific paradigms, through history, many scientists have seen God as involved in history, and yet there are times when Charles Taylor says we've become secular and we have left God out. Psychologist Viktor Frankl said the pursuit of meaning is a fundamental human urge. So what we're seeking to do in logical, rational, critical thinking is to find meaning and purpose, because that's built within us, because there's meaning and purpose built in the universe. William James was concerned that religious and scientific reductionism could be pathological. That is, if you reduced everything just to carbon atoms, then that very sense of meaning and purpose can be left out. And we mention this in our classrooms because I think it's important that education communicates to the students that there is meaning and purpose in their life, that there is meaning and purpose in their being there. There's meaning and purpose in all that they do, because it's all part of God's wonderful creation that we celebrate together, that we get excited about. So can I get everyone to write down now, what are some 3 things that have stood out from today's class, where we've gone beyond the introduction to critical thinking on Monday to look at the role of science and history and mathematics and our powers of observation and inductive observation, as well as our interaction with others who can help us with information, or they can lead us to biases. What stood out today in our study of critical thinking? What have been the highlights? And we could also think about, as Christians, what's the Christian perspective that we bring? And then we'll be meeting again on Monday, 9 to 12. We'll be looking further at this class on critical thinking for effective learning. And then Friday next week, and then we have a break for 2 weeks, and then We ask and encourage you each week to do 5 to 10 hours reading through the material, watching the videos, making some notes, keeping a file and a journal, and then beginning work on your 10 forum posts where you read 10 articles and you write a brief 300-word response to those articles, one each week for 10 weeks. And then you've got assignment 2, which we've talked a little bit about today, which is where you reflect on your views of the world and how that is helpful or at times not so helpful when you communicate and teach others. And then your third assignment, we think about 2 native Indigenous people groups that you might be teaching. How do you teach into those different worldviews that are different to our Western and modern worldview? And it could include those less Christian perspectives. Karen, what stood out to you today?
I just love the history of what I've been learning today. Well, broadening my history on Aristotle and his systematic concept of logic, Plato, his conflicting interests of different parts of society and how can it be harmonized. Socrates as a moral philosopher, I find that very, very interesting. I love the grounded theory. Look at a student and how they work and with what they are doing. So it's been really interesting today and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. And Hannah, what stood out to you?
Again, I really enjoyed the history aspect and how even the history that we have learnt about previously is actually a biased view from someone picking out elements of what happened at the time. And then when we did the activity where we had to like think back and remember a day that we had last week, I realized that the day that I picked out was actually the day that broke my normal pattern. Like normally I'd work 5 days, I'd have Saturday off and go to church on Sunday. Whereas on Saturday I went out and I did a massive road trip and went to a whole heap of different places with some friends. So it was the one thing that was different about it. So some of the stuff that I remember, I couldn't actually think about my normal pattern of a work day. I couldn't remember what happened on necessarily any one day. I could remember little bits, but I couldn't remember which day it happened. So the ones that I could remember was the breakout of the pattern, which was cool.
Yeah, so good. And Nat, what stood out to you?
Mine from today was the grounded theory. So the inductive thinking that's more based on our own observations and opinions. But then when I look at it on the other side, that we miss out on part of the story and the knowledge of other people and their opinions and thoughts to that.
Yeah, so good. And also, Bridget, what stood out to you?
Today was a really good session. I really enjoyed it. I get really kind of bored with history sometimes, but I found it really interesting. I think really what really stood out to me was when you were speaking and the importance of learning from history, but also acknowledging it and respecting it and learning from it. And also, I think passing it down as to what you think it is and what your family beliefs are.
Yeah, so important. And I think often our Western people don't have enough appreciation of family history. And in some countries, in India, I think they have someone in each family who keeps a record and they can go back hundreds and hundreds of years. So it can be really valuable. Leonie, what stood out to you today?
So what really stood out to me was the way that we think about history, especially from a Christian context, and how we need to look at that and intentionally apply it to how we teach our students. And then on the whole grounded theory and groupthink and deductive theory that we did, that it's important to consider other people's opinions and ideas and the things that they have come forward with, but it's also important to make your own decision and to make informed decisions.
Yeah, so good. And we've got to take responsibility and recognize our agency in doing that. And thanks, Amy. Yours, we posted that there, so that's appreciated. What stood out is that although there aren't external thoughts, there's preconceived ideas we come with. There are biases. It would be a good starting point, and then we go further and do further research. So that's useful. Rachel, what stood out to you?
I think the two big things for me that like everything, every like subject, every way of thinking will kind of overlap in every way, like in just maybe it's like one minor thing, but it all kind of overlaps. And I think I had to struggle that like maths is a part of dance, maths is a part of music. And I may not like math in a traditional like subject sense, but it's like it all has to overlap at some point. So like you have to kind of learn to accept it. And then another big one for me was that like we'll always have different views from each other, but like more importantly, like our most respected people and like our teachers, because I'm sure Plato and I'm sure Aristotle respected their teachers so much, but they had differing views. Like I'm sure Aristotle respected and loved Plato so much, but his views were slightly different. But like, yes, they overlap, and he probably learnt his way of thinking and found the way he likes best because of having a different like an opinion and view. That it's like, it doesn't mean that you don't respect that person any less. It just means, you know, your views slightly differ. So like, why not have a conversation about it?
Yeah, so good. And Tiffany, your views on what stood out today?
So my views were that the links with math, science, and history, how it all that diagram you showed us, how it all links back into your emotion, your family history. Like there's so many things that come into the way that we think. And from a Christian or Catholic view, I think that it's important to acknowledge, like you said, when we're doing writings, we can say, I'm a Catholic and I view things this way, and also acknowledge that my views may not be the best views or everybody's view or the right way, but that is where my train of thought comes from.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, isn't it? So if we are a Catholic, we can say, these are the values that are held, and these are the strengths and limitations of this approach. It has high social concern, high social cohesion, and there are the strengths and limitations. So that's really valuable there. Olivia, what stood out to you?
Yeah, I've come back to the actual
diagram.
The diagram. Like I just like how everything just it joins. Everything has a part of something.
Yeah. And certainly that's a good point to bring it all together, is being reminded that the diagram shows that we as human beings in this world, that there's a complexity to it, which can be studied by breaking it up into parts through scientific approaches, but we have to recognize that there is so much more going on, which keeps us humble. So look forward to seeing you all again on Monday. And so bring your thoughts, bring your questions. If you want to have a look at the Moodle site between now and then, that's good. If you haven't posted up yet an intro saying hi to everyone, then do that as well. That will be great. If you have any questions, put your hand up. Otherwise, keep in touch, and I look forward to seeing you each on Monday. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
With the discussion threads on Moodle,
Yes.
Our due dates are saying like due Friday 4th of March, due Sunday 6th of March. So for the actual overall compilation, it's got the right date, but the actual individual threads, it's showing semester 1 dates.
Yes, thank you. That is true. So it's the
The links to the discussion threads and showing like the